A country was reborn in the Balkans after the Weltkrieg. Greater Bulgaria, the titan of the peninsula, uniting all Bulgarian lands and beyond. This kingdom for all Bulgarians was born with bloodshed and war, though defeating Serbia, Greece, and Romania in the Weltkrieg, a move that these three nations were still bitter about. This tension led to the formation of the Belgrade Pact, and this alliance of the Balkan states had now declared war on the Tsardom, throwing this region into conflict yet again. In Canada, war was on everyone's mind. It would still be a minor 2 weeks before the war declaration could be fulfilled, and troops were being sent out overseas and towards the border regions. Reserves were used to fill up the gap in the middle, but they were under-equipped as Canada struggled to produce enough weapons and equipment due to the appointed land lease with the US. And the blood continued to flow at the front lines between the CSA and the US troops. Even if Canada would join the war, they would still be opposing a formidable foe that had conquered and claimed many factories and territories over the past year. In Europe, things continued in the same cynical sense as neighbors were at each other's throat, which also counted for countries in the Middle East. With equipment sent by other countries overseas, the US soldiers were able to drive the Union state out as the syndicalists eradicated them from the west flank. It would not be long before this conflict would revolve solely about the CSA and the USA. Battle plans were set up by several generals to move towards the Midwest in a sweeping motion in order to first link up with their US neighbors to combine strengths. Australasia would arrive at the West Point and protect their flank. By the 10th of April, most of the gaps had been closed, but there were not nearly enough men to hold the entire border. Most troops were inexperienced and low on ammunition and supplies. The country was 2 days away from war. Everyone could feel the tension in the air. Loved ones held each other tight one last time, and in schools and public community centers, exercises were held on what to do if Canada and their hometown would be invaded. They barely got any word on the situation in Europe, with the Balkan War claiming lives every day with all factions. And so, on the 14th of April, 1938, it began. Canada officially declared war on the syndicalists to the south. With this, a whole bunch of actions and operations were undertaken in the same day. The authorization was given for a priority build of 10 new factories across the country to support the boys at the front. The Canadians would face 500,000 syndicalist soldiers, but luckily, the Canadians did not stand alone. Though the USA was not officially an ally, the approved military access and similar goal sure made the two factions feel like allies. More importantly, all countries part of the Entente would be called in to aid in the war effort. On that same day, the first of the bombers were sent out to bomb enemy factories, to cripple their infrastructure. On that same day, fighters were traversing the skies, looking to support the soldiers moving down south and mowing down their nemesis wherever they could. And on that day, the Canadian fleet was sent out too. Though the CSA did not own a large navy, it did have a few ships that could hinder the arrival and traversal of Entente allies, and thus they would be dealt with soon. The honor of the Entente held strong, as all who received the message to aid in the war agreed to do so. And so on that day, the first of the infantry stepped over the American border and headed south without running into any resistance. Entente allies agreed to provide equipment and weapons for the Canadians as the production capabilities were low, despite an altered deal with the Americans. During the first 3 days of marching, no battles were fought except for on the sea and in the air. Morale on the men rose, especially in the west, where the unsupplied troops retook the first territories. They were welcomed by the citizens stuck under a cruel regime, and the Americans handed gifts and food to the soldiers to show their thanks. By April 18th, Germany had claimed a victory over Belgium that stood no chance to begin with. On the seas, the Canadian ships battled it out with the few that the Syndicalists possessed. The Canadians dominated the sea, sinking vessel after vessel. On the fourth day, resistance was first met by the ground troops to the east. Those first conflicts were often small skirmishes, ending up in the favor of the Canadians. This was mostly due to the fact that the CSA troops headed there were sent as an emergency procedure to slow the Canadians down rather than to counter them. News then arrived from Europe. The Serbian government had gone into exile, and their main forces capitulated to the Austrian Empire, who was now in control of their home area. The struggles between the Austrian Empire and the Kingdom of Serbia was only a small part of the conflict. But on the 21st of April, Bulgaria took the majority of claimed land, though promising to reinstate certain governments in their favor of returning the borders of the Balkan states in due time. The war with Canada and the Syndicalists was now going on for over a week without little to fear for the Canadians. The combined front of the US and their troops was still far apart, but the knowledge that Allied troops of the Entente were on their way as well made them fear nothing. It even went so smooth that television and papers had room for news on a smaller scale, including the unfortunate death of Billy Bishop. He was a Canadian fighter ace and local hero who was killed in an accident when his plane collided with another plane over the airfield in Regina. The broad front line to the west had now almost entirely shifted southward, without any form of resistance being shown. It proved that the American landscape was so big that it was not possible for the CSA to send troops over there in time before losing some precious territory. The war concerning the Ottoman Empire also endured, as Yemen and the Ottomans agreed on a white peace, as other countries were still at their throats. The Kingdom of France joined Australasia in providing Canada with infantry equipment to resupply the troops that had run into Syndicalist contact. The war looked great for the US and Canadian infantry. The fact that the CSA troops had to split up to fight at two fronts meant less resistance for the men at Washington, who probed an early attempt at storm heading north to link up with the Canadians. But then, on May the 4th, the first blow of defeat occurred for Canada as more experienced troops arrived to reinforce the CSA front. These were battle-hardened from fighting the US soldiers and had no problem dealing with the Canadian newcomers. And by the end of the first week of May, the Western Front had now also been halted as CSA infantry had arrived near almost every frontal position. Then some disturbing news arrived from Spain, where the civil war had been raging on for ages. Reports from Madrid confirmed that the Spanish city had been captured by advancing anarcho-syndicalist troops after long, merciless fighting through the hilly terrain and the old city. Spanish forces put up stiff resistance, hoping to delay the anarcho-syndicalist. Though wars were fought all throughout the world, the one war that people did forget about was the one between the Pacific states and Mexico, whereas Mexico did not abide by the claimed territories provided to them. If Syndicalist Mexico would eventually get involved in the war to their north as well, it could have disastrous consequences. The American soldiers had trouble heading north, as many attempts were cut off at the route, and hundreds of soldiers sometimes were left to their fate despite their noble attempts. Though the Canadians had to deal with some setbacks, and the first of the dead arrived back from the front, spirits were still optimistic, and the local news had time to mourn another war hero. General Edmund Allenby died in his exile at Ottawa, aged 75. Retired since 1925, he was mostly known as the Commander-in-Chief of the British Expeditionary Forces in the Middle East. After achieving major victories thanks to the Arab help, such as taking Jerusalem, he was forced to withdraw as the Weltkrieg went bad for England. By honoring him with the state funerals, King Edward wanted to show his desire for revenge. Halfway through May, word got out that many Portuguese ships had now been sighted in American waters to help secure the convoy routes and also provide men to help fight the war. The papers hailed their Portuguese allies for the quick arrival. But then, a week later, hopes and smiles were crushed as the terrible news arrived that Washington, the city that was protected and had to endure for so many months, had fallen. Syndicate militias had advanced towards and captured the symbolic capital of the United States. They stormed the Capitol building and met strong resistance, but eventually they broke through the troops of Washington's hope, and the flag of the Combined Syndicates of America now flew over this US Capitol. Rumors were that syndicate militias had been rounding up all political representatives they could find in the city to give them trial, although unconfirmed sources claimed that the most important government figures had been evacuated during the battle with their current whereabouts unknown. This was a devastating blow for the US, but also Canada, that had just recently got involved. Though the US was able to win some territory back over the past months, this symbolic defeat would weigh dearly on its troops. Skeptics were afraid that the battles were for naught, and that soon Canada would have to face the CSA by herself after all.